We're going to begin talking about the musculoskeletal system. So what is the musculoskeletal system? It's the system that allows our body to move. It allows us for all types of controlled motions, the coarse and the very fine motion, such as motion of our fingers, motion of our mouth, motion of our tongue, our ability to speak, our ability to sing, and also our ability to run, our ability to pull weights, to carry objects, and to not lose our balance. We can talk about 3 different types of skeletal systems, and you have probably already looked at some of them in the lab as you dissected a few of the animals. I want you to recall the types of skeletons: the hydrostatic skeletons, exoskeletons, and the endoskeletons. Let's start with the hydrostatic skeletons. Those are common in the simplest of animals. What is a hydrostatic skeleton? It is basically a tube filled with water, and it is the water pressure inside the tube that gives the animal some rigidity. And against that tube, the muscles of these small animals can push. What kind of animals use these? Well, think back looking at the earthworm that you have dissected. So the earthworms have a hydrostatic skeleton. They also have lots of circular muscles all the way along their bodies, and the contractions of these muscles allow them to crawl through the ground. Here is a picture of a crawling earthworm, and you can see that these peristaltic-like contractions of the muscles pushing against the internal hydrostatic skeleton. This is what propels the earthworm as it moves through the dirt. Exoskeletons are quite common. They're common because lots and lots of animals have them. Actually, the most numerous group of animals, the arthropods, they all have exoskeletons. And these are basically hard, rigid cases that surround the body of the animal. It is a great way to protect the innards of the animal, to protect the muscles. So the muscles are going to be attached on the inside of the exoskeleton. Now, the one problem that the animals with the exoskeleton have is that they cannot grow very big. And when they want to grow, they must lose their exoskeleton or they must molt. And then for a time, before their new, larger exoskeleton hardens, they actually have to go into hiding because they're very soft-bodied at the time. The exoskeleton has another limitation. It is heavy. It is as if the animal was trying to carry a full body armor, so it limits the size to which the animal can grow, and probably, luckily so. So our Texas cockroaches can only grow so big and not any bigger than that. Here is an example of an exoskeleton of an arthropod, and this is a grasshopper. So you can see that there are points of muscle attachments on the inside, and there are going to be muscles inside the limbs of this animal as well. Now, the endoskeletons, those are typical of higher animals. All vertebrates have endoskeleton. Endo means internal. We have our skeletons on the inside, and that allows us to grow quite large muscles. We do not have to molt. We can simply elongate the bones of our skeleton, add onto them, and we can grow as large muscles as we want to. So our endoskeleton is a rigid framework to which all our muscles are attached. It's mainly made of calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate. Depending on which type of animals we look at, we humans have mostly calcium phosphate. The endoskeletons of most vertebrate animals are made up of 2 types of tissue, of bone and of cartilage. Bone is not very flexible, but it's very, very strong. cartilage is softer and allows some flexibility. It is also important in parts of the skeleton that need to expand, for example, in your rib cage, where parts of your lower ribs and also the attachment points of your ribs are actually made out of cartilage, allowing your rib cage to expand as you breathe. The second important property of the vertebrate endoskeleton is the ability to grow from the inside. Bone and cartilage are living tissues. That means that they can grow and they can also heal in case they're injured. Here's an example of an endoskeleton of a common animal. This is a cat, and these are the very typical parts of the skeleton: the skull, the backbone, the ribs, and the front and hind appendages, as well as the pelvis. Bone is very, very hard, but nevertheless, it's still a connective tissue. Connective tissue, as you might recall, is a tissue where you have cells that are separated from one another, embedded in a medium that we call matrix. In case of bone, that matrix is going to be very hard. But nevertheless, that matrix is going to contain living cells. Those living cells will be responsible for elongating the bone and for healing the bone in case of a breakage. The normal elongation of a bone happens at the growth plates, and the growth plates are areas of active bone growth until about early adulthood, at which point we humans stop growing. So here's a picture of a bone, and you can see the main parts of the bone, the epiphysis and the diaphysis here, and there is a second epiphysis on the other end. So those are the little wider end portions of the bone. Inside the bone, we have the red marrow, and then we also have the medullary cavity. Notice that the bone has many small openings through which the parts of the circulatory system enter and exit. So we have arteries and we have veins that go into the bone because there are living cells that have to be fed. If you look at a small slice of the bone, you can actually see that it's organized in little lacunae, and inside the lacunae sit the osteocytes. Those are the cells that are secreting the bone. Inside the canals around which the osteocytes and the lacunae are organized, inside the canals we have the capillaries. Those are the blood vessels that are feeding osteocytes, and we also have, do you know what that yellow wiry looking thing is here on the diagram? Yes, it's going to be a nerve. Bones are innervated. Just like any part of your body, bones are innervated. Let's take a closer look at the microscopic structure. So here we're looking down at one of those Haversian canals. You should remember that from when we looked at tissues. Haversian canal right here, and here the lacunae, and you see those tiny little openings where the osteocytes are sitting. So osteocytes are immobilized. They're entombed inside the bone. They can't move anywhere, but the blood vessels provide them with nutrients and oxygen that they need. There are two categories of a bone. There is a compact bone and medullary bone. And this is really division based on the structure. And then inside the epiphyses of the bone, we have the spongy bone. It really isn't soft. It just appears spongy. By looking, it is quite hard, in fact. And we had seen this on the previous picture. Right here, we have another picture of the spongy bone here. We can also classify bones in terms of how they actually develop inside the body during the embryonic development. And there are two methods which the bones can develop. One is called the intramembranous development. Intramembranous means that the bones develop inside two layers of membranes. Those membranes are made out of connective tissue, and that kind of development is very typical for the bones of the skull. Some additional bones in the body, usually typically smaller, flatter bones, will develop by intramembranous development. The second way that the bones develop is called the endochondral development. So what happens there is as the fetus, at this point it's already a fetus, begins to develop its internal skeleton, endoskeleton, these bones begin as little tiny cartilaginous modules that gradually get invaded by osteocytes, and those osteocytes begin to deposit the hard material that makes the bone, and eventually these cartilaginous bones become hard, calcified bones by the time the organism is born. This is certainly the case in human development, although a newborn human still has parts of its bones quite soft, and they will need to calcify over the first few months of life. Because bone is a living tissue, it can be remodeled. What is remodeling? Well, remodeling means that you change some. You can remodel your kitchen, your bathroom. You can also remodel your bone. That means that bone will respond to stress that is put on it. What kind of stress? For instance, mechanical stress. Mechanical stress happens when you walk. It happens when you run. It happens when you lift weights. All of these activities that put certain amount of pressure on the bone, not too much pressure, of course, because you don't want to break the bone, but the pressure is going to thicken the bone. It's going to make it actually stronger. It also is going to sometimes change its shape to some extent. So you probably heard that osteoporosis is a frequent ailment of elderly people, and actually that could be helped by mild weightlifting. And actually it's one of the treatments that helps to prolong the period of independence and activity in elderly people, especially the ones who are beginning to develop osteoporosis. That further development of the disease can actually be stopped by weight training. Here's an example of what happens to the bone that is subject to stress. You can see that if we selectively apply force from one side of the bone for a long period of time, the bone will respond by thickening on that side to accommodate that force. In this case, the force is actually coming from the top here, so the entire tube of the bone will thicken as a result of the stress. The bones are joined together with joints, also known as the articulations. Joints are known as the articulations. So joints are places where one bone meets the other. There are four basic types of joints: the ball and socket joints, such as the one that accommodates our longest bone, femur, into the pelvis, the pelvic joint. That's a very typical example of a ball and socket joint. So those are the most movable joints. We also have a joint like that in our arm that allows us to move in every direction. Then there are hinge joints which allow movement in one plane, so those would be your elbows or your knees. Gliding joints, and think about where would you have a gliding joint. Actually, you would have them in your jaw. Your mandibles can glide. They can slide one surface over the other. And then combination joints, which will be able to move in different position. We also have the gliding joints right in our backbone here. The skeletal muscles will allow you to move because they are attached to the skeleton and they are attached on two sides across one joint. The only thing that the muscle can do is muscle can contract and it can also relax. Muscles cannot push, they can only pull. That means that when muscle contracts, it shortens, pulling on the two bones that are attached to each other via a joint. Muscles a lot of times are going to be antagonistic in the body. So that means that one group of muscles will oppose the action of the other. And a very easy to understand example of this is our upper leg, where we have the flexors and extensors. Our flexors are our hamstrings. They allow our leg to flex or bend at the knee joint, and our extensors are going to allow us to straighten by shortening and pulling. And you can see the attachment. The tendons are attached to these opposite bones here, and as the extensors or our quadriceps contract, our leg straightens. So those are really large groups of muscles. They have to be very, very strong. The next part of the video is going to be a McGraw-Hill video that I'm going to post for you, and this is the explanation of a muscle contraction, and then we'll go back to it in a second short video that I will make for you next.